In 1977, she chose her dreams over love. What happened decades later? Some stories begin with love. This one begins with the sound of a door closing. Autumn, 1977. Margaret Sullivan stood in the hallway of the apartment she'd called home for 8 years, staring at the empty space where her husband's coat used to hang. The note on the kitchen counter was brief, cruel in its efficiency. He'd left. With her best friend. The woman who'd held Margaret's hand through every difficult moment of her marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her. Neither was the wedding ring still heavy on her finger. What Margaret didn't know that morning, as she collapsed onto the linoleum floor of her kitchen, was that betrayal would become her greatest teacher. That the love she lost would lead her to something far more valuable. But first, she would have to walk through fire. The 1970s wasn't kind to abandoned women. In a world where a woman couldn't open a bank account without her husband's signature, where divorce meant social death, and where independence was considered unfeminine, Margaret found herself facing an impossible question. Who was she without him? The first week she barely moved. The curtains stayed drawn. Friends called, but their sympathy felt like pity, so she stopped answering. Her sister drove 3 hours to check on her, only to find Margaret still in her nightgown, surrounded by unopened mail and cold coffee cups. "You have to get up," her sister pleaded. But Margaret couldn't. Not yet. Because getting up meant accepting that her life, the one she'd carefully built, the one she'd believed in, was gone. Then something happened that changed everything. But it wasn't what you'd expect. On day 11, Margaret's landlord knocked. The rent was due. 3 months overdue, actually. Her husband had been handling the finances, or so she'd thought. The truth hit her like ice water. He'd stopped paying weeks before he left. The accounts were empty. She had $47 in her purse, a closet full of dresses, and 2 weeks to vacate the apartment. Most women in her position would have called their fathers, begged family for help, accepted whatever rescue was offered. Margaret walked to the phone, stared at it for 20 minutes, and then made a different choice. She hung up the receiver without dialing. That moment, that tiny act of not asking to be saved, became the first brick in a foundation she didn't even know she was building. The practical realities of survival came fast and sharp. Margaret hadn't worked since her wedding day. Proper wives didn't work after all. She had no references, no skills employers wanted, no college degree. The classified ads in the newspaper mocked her. Secretary needed, must type 65 words per minute. She could type 20 maybe. Waitress wanted, experience required. She'd never served anyone but her husband, but there was one ad that made her pause. Night shift clerk, Starlight Motor Inn. No experience necessary. It was the kind of place women like Margaret didn't work. The kind of job that would make her mother weep with shame. She took a deep breath, cut the ad from the newspaper, and realized she no longer cared what she was supposed to do. The interview was brief. The manager, a weathered woman named Dolores, looked her up and down. "You running from something, sweetheart?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Good," Dolores said, sliding the application across the desk. "That means you'll show up." Working nights at the Starlight Motor Inn was nothing like the life Margaret had known. The polyester uniform itched. Her feet ached from standing. The guests were a parade of humanity she'd never encountered in her previous life. Traveling salesmen, young couples on illicit adventures, families on cross-country journeys, people with stories etched into their tired faces. But something unexpected happened between the midnight check-ins and the lonely hours of cleaning rooms. Margaret started to see clearly. Without her husband's voice telling her who to be, without her friends' judgments about what was appropriate, without society's narrow definitions of a woman's worth, she began to discover someone she'd never met before. Herself. The other women working nights became her unlikely teachers. Rosa, the housekeeper who'd fled an abusive husband with 3 children. Evelyn, the single mother working 2 jobs to put her son through college. Jackie, the widow who'd rebuilt her life at 60. These weren't the country club women Margaret had once tried to impress. These were survivors. And slowly, Margaret was becoming one of them. 3 months into her new life, Margaret walked past a storefront on her way home from work. The windows were dark, covered with yellowing newspaper. A for lease sign hung crooked on the door. She stopped, stared at her reflection in the dusty glass, and for the first time since her husband left, felt something other than pain or determination. She felt possibility. The idea came to her fully formed, as if it had been waiting in her subconscious all along. A small restaurant. Nothing fancy. The kind of place where people could get a good meal at midnight, where the night shift workers, the insomniacs, the lonely travelers could find a warm plate and a kind word. She had no money, no business experience, no logical reason to believe she could succeed. But she'd learned something important working at the Starlight. Sometimes the most practical thing you can do is believe in something impractical. What happened next would test every ounce of courage Margaret had found. Because dreams, she was about to learn, always cost more than you expect to pay. The bank manager listened to Margaret's proposal with barely concealed amusement. A woman wanting a business loan? Without a husband to co-sign? In 1977? He didn't even pretend to consider it. Perhaps your father could help, he suggested, in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over. Margaret tried 6 more banks. The answer was always the same. Some managers were kind, most weren't. One told her frankly, "Women don't have the temperament for business. It's nothing personal." She wanted to argue, to prove them wrong, to make them see her as she'd finally begun to see herself. But their minds were closed doors, locked from the inside. Rock bottom has a way of clarifying things. Margaret was running out of time and options. The landlord had given her 1 more month in her tiny rented room. Her savings, what little she'd managed to scrape together, would last another 3 weeks, maybe 4 if she stopped eating lunch. Most people would have given up, accepted the world's verdict that women like her weren't meant for more than what they'd been given. Instead, Margaret did something that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She went back to the Starlight and asked Dolores if they could talk. Over coffee in the empty breakfast room at 3 a.m., Margaret laid out her plan. The restaurant, the empty storefront, the impossible dream. Dolores listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Margaret finished, there was a long silence. "How much do you need?" Dolores finally asked. Margaret told her. It wasn't much by business standards, but it might as well have been $1 million. Dolores nodded slowly, pulled a cigarette from her purse, lit it, and exhaled a long stream of smoke. "I've got about half that saved up," she said. "Been putting money aside for 20 years, waiting for something worth investing in." Margaret started to protest. She couldn't take Dolores's life savings, but Dolores held up her hand. "I'm not giving it to you. I'm investing. In you and in the restaurant. Partners. 50-50. She extended her hand across the table. "I've watched you these past months. You've got something most people don't. You're not afraid of starting over. That's worth more than any business degree." The handshake that followed was a covenant between 2 women who understood that sometimes the only way forward is together. The next 6 months were the hardest of Margaret's life. Harder than the betrayal, harder than the sleepless nights, harder than the shame and the fear and the loneliness combined. She and Dolores worked 18-hour days renovating the storefront. Margaret learned to lay tile, fix plumbing, negotiate with suppliers, calculate food costs. Her hands, once soft and manicured, became calloused and paint-stained. Her body ached. Her doubts multiplied. There were moments when she wanted to quit, like when the health inspector found violations that required expensive fixes, or when the first 2 cooks she hired quit after a week, or when she lay awake at 4 a.m., doing math in her head, realizing they were short on the electric bill. Each crisis felt like confirmation that maybe those bank managers had been right. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this. But there was Rosa, bringing tamales her mother made, refusing payment. There was Evelyn, bringing her son to help paint on weekends. There was Jackie, spreading word about the restaurant to everyone she knew. And there was Dolores, steady as a lighthouse, always believing when Margaret couldn't. The restaurant, they named it the Midnight Rose, opened on a cold November night in 1978. 12 people showed up that first evening. By the end of the first month, they were breaking even. By the 3rd month, there was a waiting list for tables. But success brought its own complications. Margaret's estranged husband heard about the restaurant. He showed up one evening, charming as ever, with her former best friend on his arm. They sat at a corner table, ordered coffee, and watched Margaret work with an expression somewhere between curiosity and condescension. When they left, her husband stopped by the register. "Congratulations," he said, and it sounded like an insult wrapped in civility. "I always knew you had it in you." As if he'd been supportive, as if he'd believed in her, as if his abandonment hadn't been the catalyst for everything she'd become. Margaret felt the old familiar ache, the desire to defend herself, to make him understand what his leaving had cost her. Then she looked around the restaurant, at the tables filled with people eating food she'd prepared, at Dolores managing the front with practiced efficiency, at Rosa laughing with a regular customer, at the life she'd built from the ruins of her marriage. "Thank you for leaving," she said quietly. And she meant it. The years that followed weren't a fairy tale. There were health scares and financial setbacks. There was the time the freezer broke and they lost a week's worth of food. There was the lawsuit from a customer who claimed food poisoning. There was the year a new diner opened across the street with more capital and flashier decor. Each challenge threatened to unravel everything Margaret and Dolores had built, but they persevered. And slowly, the Midnight Rose became more than a restaurant. It became a sanctuary. Single mothers came for affordable meals. Newly divorced women came seeking advice. Young women struggling against society's expectations came for the unspoken message that radiated from every corner of the space. You are capable of more than you know. Margaret never remarried. People asked, of course. Well-meaning friends set her up on dates. But she'd discovered something more fulfilling than romantic love. She'd discovered autonomy, purpose, the profound satisfaction of building something with her own hands, the joy of providing not just food, but hope to women who walked through her door carrying the same devastation she'd once carried. Few years later, the Midnight Rose had become a local institution. Margaret was 42 years old. She'd been alone for 6 years, and she'd never been less lonely. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, forwarded from her old apartment building. The return address was from a law office in Boston. Inside was a brief note. Her ex-husband had died suddenly. Heart attack. Age 45. There was no request for her attendance at the funeral, just a notification as required by law. Margaret sat with the letter for a long time. She waited for grief or anger or some complicated mixture of emotions. Instead, she felt only a strange, peaceful closure. The man who'd defined so much of her life, first through his presence, then through his absence, was gone. And she realized that he'd been gone from her heart for years. What she hadn't expected was what came 2 weeks later. Another letter from the same law office. Her ex-husband had never removed her as beneficiary on his life insurance policy. The payout was substantial. Not a fortune, but enough to change everything. Most people would have seen it as justice, poetic irony. The man who'd left her penniless, inadvertently providing for her in death. Margaret saw it as a choice. She could keep the money, expand the restaurant, secure her financial future. Or she could do something else. Something that honored not who her ex-husband had been, but who she'd become in his absence. She called a meeting with Dolores and the other women who'd become her chosen family over the years. She laid out her idea. With the insurance money, they could create something unprecedented. A fund to help women start businesses. Not loans that required husbands' signatures or fathers' cosigns. Not charity that came with shame. Real investment in women who had dreams, but no access to capital. "We'll call it the Rose Fund," Margaret said, "and we'll change the rules." The impact was immediate and profound. The first recipient was a young widow with 3 children who wanted to open a small bakery. The second was a divorced seamstress who dreamed of her own shop. The third was a 22-year-old who'd left an abusive marriage and wanted to go to nursing school. Each woman represented a different path, but they all shared the same invisible barrier. A world that measured their worth by their marital status rather than their potential. Word spread. Women came from neighboring towns, then neighboring states. Some succeeded, some failed and tried again. Some discovered they wanted different dreams than they'd originally imagined, but every single one of them learned the same lesson Margaret had learned, that survival is holy work, and that the courage to begin again is the most radical act of self-love. By 1988, the Rose Fund had helped start 43 small businesses. Margaret was 45 years old. The Midnight Rose now had 2 locations, and she'd become something she'd never planned to become, a quiet revolutionary in sensible shoes, changing the world one woman at a time. People often asked Margaret if she ever regretted the path her life had taken, if she wished her husband hadn't left, if she missed the comfortable, conventional life she'd once had. Her answer was always the same: you can't regret the fire that forged you. The truth was more complicated, of course. She'd loved her husband once. The betrayal had nearly destroyed her. The first year alone had been excruciating. There were still moments when loneliness crept in, when she wondered what life might have looked like if he'd stayed. But those moments grew rarer as the years passed, replaced by something more sustaining than romantic love: pride in who she'd become, gratitude for the women who'd walked beside her, joy in the work she'd created. The Midnight Rose operated for 32 years. The Rose Fund helped over 600 women start businesses before it was absorbed into a larger foundation. And the women who'd known her understood that heroism doesn't always look like what we expect, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to stay broken. That betrayal can become your origin story if you're brave enough to write the next chapter yourself. Here's what Margaret never told anyone, not even Dolores. That day her husband left. When she found the note on the kitchen counter, there was a second page. She'd kept it folded in her wallet for 40 years, until the paper was soft as cloth from repeated reading. The second page wasn't from her husband. It was from her former best friend, and it said, "I know you'll hate me forever, and you should, but I need you to know something. He was planning to take everything, the accounts, the apartment, even your grandmother's jewelry. I convinced him to leave it all behind by agreeing to go with him. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry I had to hurt you to save you. You deserved better than both of us. Please build something beautiful with your life." The woman who'd betrayed her had actually saved her. The loss that had broken Margaret open had been, in its strange way, an act of love. Margaret never reached out, never sought forgiveness or explanation. Some stories don't need resolution. They need integration. And she'd integrated that pain into purpose, that betrayal into building, that loss into a legacy that would outlive them all. In the end, it wasn't the love she lost that defined her. It was the life she found when she stopped waiting to be saved and started saving herself. Closing. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us becomes the doorway to our truest self. Margaret's story isn't unique. Thousands of women in every generation face the same choice between accepting defeat and choosing to begin again. Her gift to us isn't the happy ending. It's the reminder that there is no shame in starting over, no weakness in walking alone, no failure in building a different life than the one you planned. The love you lose might be the love you needed to lose to find yourself. The betrayal that breaks you might be the break that sets you free. And the hardest journey you'll ever take, the one where no one's applauding, where you're terrified and exhausted and unsure, might lead you exactly where you needed to go all along. If Margaret's story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us about a time you found strength you didn't know you had, and hit the like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us all we're stronger than we know, braver than we believe, and capable of surviving anything.